The woman who called me a failure had no idea the future of her company was resting on my signature. My name is Michael Carter, and if you had met me 2 days before everything changed, you probably would have believed every word my wife ever said about me. I wasn't the loudest man in the room. I didn't wear expensive watches. I didn't drive a sports car through downtown Chicago or post motivational quotes about success on social media. Most mornings started the same way. I brewed coffee before sunrise, watered the small maple tree I planted the year Emily and I bought our house, and read the business section while the neighborhood slowly came to life. To most people, I looked ordinary. That was exactly how I wanted it. Emily used to admire that about me. Back when we were both struggling to pay rent, she'd tell her friends that I was the calmest person she'd ever met. She said I made chaos feel manageable. Somewhere along the way, that compliment disappeared. Success has a strange way of changing people. It doesn't always reveal who they are. Sometimes it convinces them they've become someone else entirely. Emily's career took off faster than either of us imagined. She joined a fast-growing logistics company, earned one promotion after another, and before long she was leading major expansion projects that put her in the same room as executives who flew private jets and measured deals in 8 figures instead of thousands. I celebrated every victory with her. Every late night at the office, every award, every new title, every impossible deadline she somehow conquered. I never asked for credit because I believed marriage wasn't about keeping score. Somewhere between her promotions and the company galas, though, our conversations became shorter. Our dinners became quieter. Her compliments turned into observations. Then observations became criticisms. Eventually, criticisms became labels. Reliable became boring. Quiet became weak. Humble became unsuccessful. One evening, while adjusting the cuff links on a tailored suit she'd bought for an executive fundraiser, she looked at me through the bedroom mirror and laughed softly. "Michael," she said, "some people are just born to lead. Others, well, they're just comfortable staying average." She smiled as if she'd made an innocent joke. I smiled back because arguing would have changed nothing. You learn a lot when you stop defending yourself. You hear what people really think. A month later, she stopped introducing me by my profession. Instead, she'd simply say, "This is my husband, Michael." The pause afterward always lasted a little too long. Long enough for someone else to ask what I did. Long enough for Emily to answer before I could. "Nothing very exciting," she'd say with an apologetic smile. I never corrected her. Not because I couldn't. Because I was waiting for the right moment. The invitation to Whitestone Hall arrived on a Thursday afternoon. It was the company's annual leadership gala, a celebration reserved for senior management, investors, banking partners, and select guests. Emily placed the envelope on the kitchen counter without looking up from her phone. "You should come," she said. "Just don't make it awkward." I looked at her for a second before asking the obvious question. "Awkward?" She shrugged. "You know how these events are? Everyone's accomplished. Everyone talks business. Just let me handle the conversations." I nodded once. "Of course." She thanked me with the same distracted expression people use after someone agrees to watch their luggage at the airport. Saturday evening arrived with cold autumn air rolling across the city. Whitestone Hall shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors that reflected every light in the room. Valets opened doors for luxury sedans while executives greeted each other with practiced confidence. Emily stepped out of the car wearing a dark emerald gown that turned heads before she even reached the entrance. She looked successful because she was successful. I was genuinely proud of her. Walking beside her, I noticed how quickly she adjusted her pace, creating just enough distance that we no longer looked like a couple entering together. Inside, servers carried silver trays through clusters of guests discussing mergers, forecasts, and expansion strategies. Everywhere I looked, people were measuring one another without saying it aloud. Emily blended into that world effortlessly. I watched her laugh with directors, shake hands with investors, and accept compliments that seemed to make her stand a little taller each time. Then I heard someone ask the question I'd heard 100 times before. "Emily, who's your guest?" She smiled politely before answering. "Oh, that's my husband." She hesitated just long enough to glance toward me. Then she added with a quiet laugh that carried farther than she intended, "He'll always be a failure, but at least he's a very supportive one." The circle erupted with polite laughter. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others simply smiled because nobody wants to challenge the rising executive whose future seems unlimited. I stood there holding my untouched glass of sparkling water, listening to strangers laugh about a man they didn't know. Emily never looked back to see whether I was smiling. She assumed she already knew exactly who I was. She had no idea that less than 48 hours later, the same people laughing beside her would discover that the future of her company depended on one name written neatly across a single page. Mine. I stayed where I was for another few minutes after the laughter faded, not because I enjoyed the humiliation, but because walking away too quickly would have given everyone exactly what they expected. A defeated man leaves early. A calm man finishes his drink. That difference matters more than most people realize. I watched conversations resume as if nothing had happened. Deals were discussed. Champagne glasses touched. Smiles returned. Emily was already across the ballroom speaking with Richard Hayes, the company's chief executive officer, her confidence glowing beneath the crystal lights. Richard was the kind of executive business magazines love to photograph. Perfect suit, perfect smile, perfect timing. He placed a reassuring hand on Emily's shoulder while reviewing something on his tablet, and she nodded with the focused expression that had earned her promotion after promotion. From a distance, they looked like two people carrying the future of the company together. What nobody in that ballroom could see was the weight already pressing down on both of them. I wandered toward one of the tall windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city shimmered beneath the autumn night, thousands of lights stretching toward the horizon. 15 years earlier, Emily and I had stood on a much smaller apartment balcony looking at the same skyline. Back then we dreamed about paying off student loans and maybe taking one vacation every couple of years. We promised each other that success would never change who we were. It sounded easy when success still belonged to someone else. A waiter approached with another tray. I accepted a glass of sparkling water and thanked him. He smiled without recognizing me. I preferred it that way. Recognition often creates expectations, and expectations usually invite unnecessary conversations. I had learned long ago that silence reveals more than questions ever could. As I stood there, fragments of conversation drifted across the room. Revenue targets, expansion plans, interest rates, lending committees. One phrase caught my attention. Bridge financing. Another followed. Conditional approval. Then I heard Richard lower his voice. The bank is still waiting for the final authorization. Emily answered carefully. They promised everything would be ready by Monday morning. Richard nodded. But even from across the room, I could see the tension settling behind his smile. That was unusual. Richard rarely looked uncertain. Emily excused herself a few moments later and headed toward me with measured steps. Her expression was composed until we were alone beside the windows. Then it changed. Not softer, just tired. You could have helped back there, she said quietly. I looked at her. Helped how? She exhaled. You could have laughed. Made it less uncomfortable. I almost smiled at the irony. For whom? She folded her arms. Michael, not everything is about you. I let that sentence settle between us. You are right, I answered. Tonight seems to be about everyone else. Before she could respond, another executive called her name. She turned without another word and disappeared into the crowd once again. I finished my drink and quietly left the ballroom before midnight. The drive home was peaceful. Chicago traffic had finally thinned, and the streets reflected the orange glow of traffic lights after a brief evening rain. Emily arrived nearly an hour later. She kicked off her heels near the front door and dropped her purse onto the kitchen island. Neither of us spoke immediately. I poured 2 cups of coffee, even though it was late. Habit sometimes says what words cannot. She accepted the mug without thanking me. Richard thinks we are finally going to close the financing on Monday, she said while staring into the steam. If everything goes through, this company will double in size within 3 years. That sounds important, I replied. It is everything, she answered. People's careers depend on it. I nodded slowly. I hope it works out. She looked at me with visible frustration. That is all you have to say? I met her eyes. What would you like me to say? She shook her head. Sometimes I wonder if you even understand how business works anymore. The room grew quiet again. The old kitchen clock ticked steadily above the refrigerator. Outside, a cool wind rattled the maple leaves against the window. I took another sip of coffee before answering. You might be surprised. She laughed softly, the same polite laugh I had heard at the gala. Michael, You have always been optimistic. She carried her cup upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the silence. A few minutes later, my cellular telephone vibrated against the countertop. The screen displayed a familiar name I had not seen in several weeks. Daniel Brooks, Executive Vice President, Whitestone National Bank. The call arrived at exactly 11:23 at night. There are moments in life that sound ordinary when they begin. This was one of them. I answered calmly. "Good evening, Daniel." His voice carried the measured confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions worth millions of dollars. "Michael, I apologize for calling this late, but we have reached the final stage. Before the committee meets Monday morning, there is one approval we still need from you." Daniel never wasted words, especially after business hours. That was one of the reasons I trusted him. In banking, people who talk too much are usually trying to distract you from something important. "I am listening," I said. I could hear papers being moved on his desk before he spoke again. "Our credit committee has completed its review. The numbers are solid. The collateral structure is acceptable. The board is prepared to authorize the $18 million commercial loan first thing Monday morning." He paused just long enough for the silence to matter. "However, there is still one condition that cannot be removed." I leaned back in my chair and looked through the kitchen window toward the maple tree swaying beneath the porch light. "My personal guarantee." "Yes," Daniel replied. "Without your signature, the approval expires immediately." I closed my eyes for a brief moment. 15 years of careful planning had led to a conversation that sounded almost ordinary. The strange thing about real power is that it rarely announces itself. Most of the time it arrives quietly, in the form of contracts, trust, and names written where very few people ever bother to look. Daniel continued carefully. "I know this situation is complicated." That made me smile for the first time all evening. Complicated is one way to describe it. He lowered his voice. "I also know your wife is leading this expansion project. If you choose not to sign, no one at the company can replace your guarantee before the deadline." The kitchen suddenly felt even quieter. Upstairs, I could hear faint footsteps as Emily moved through our bedroom, getting ready for bed, completely unaware that the future of her biggest professional achievement was hanging on a conversation taking place just below her. "How much do they know?" I asked. "Only the committee, legal counsel, and myself understand the complete structure," Daniel answered. "The executives assume the financing package stands on the company's financial performance alone." I nodded, even though he could not see me. "And Richard? He believes the final paperwork is only administrative." That was exactly what I expected. Richard Hayes was an excellent executive, but he had inherited relationships he never bothered to investigate. He saw balance sheets. I saw people. That difference had always mattered more than quarterly reports. Daniel waited patiently before asking the question he had called to ask. "Will you approve the guarantee?" I did not answer immediately. Instead, my mind drifted back more than a decade to another office on another rainy afternoon. Emily had just accepted her first management position. Her company was small then, ambitious but fragile, struggling to convince banks that rapid growth did not automatically mean unacceptable risk. Their first financing request had been rejected twice. Investors hesitated. Lenders hesitated. Everyone wanted proof that someone with established credibility believed in the business. I believed in Emily long before anyone else did. My own investment firm had spent years building an exceptionally conservative financial reputation. We never chased headlines. We never pursued unnecessary publicity. Quiet consistency became our greatest asset. When Daniel's predecessor approached me privately about supporting Emily's employer, I agreed under one condition. My involvement would remain completely confidential. Emily wanted to succeed on her own merits, and I respected that dream. Every renewal since then had carried the same arrangement. My signature remained invisible, but the confidence attached to my name opened doors that financial statements alone could not. I never mentioned it at home. Not once. I wanted Emily to believe she had earned every victory because, in many ways, she had. She worked harder than almost anyone I knew. What changed was not her work ethic. It was the way success slowly convinced her that she had climbed the mountain alone. Daniel interrupted my thoughts gently. "Michael." I returned to the present. "I am still here. The committee meets at 8:30 Monday morning. I will need your decision before then." I glanced toward the staircase again. Emily had stopped moving. The house settled into the familiar quiet that always arrived after midnight. Tell me something honestly, I said. If I decline, what happens? Daniel answered without hesitation. The loan is denied. The acquisition collapses. Expansion stops immediately. Hundreds of employees face uncertainty. Investors lose confidence. Your wife's career will almost certainly suffer significant damage. I thanked him for telling me the truth instead of offering polished corporate language. Honesty has always been more valuable than optimism. And if I sign? I asked. The company receives the financing. Monday becomes the biggest victory in its history. After we ended the call, I remained alone in the kitchen for nearly an hour. The unsigned authorization package sat securely inside my private document portal, waiting for a single electronic signature. One click could change everything. One refusal could change everything differently. The decision was never really about Emily. It was about every engineer, accountant, warehouse supervisor, driver, receptionist, and young employee who had built their future around promises made by people sitting in executive offices. They had done nothing to deserve becoming collateral damage. I finally stood, switched off the kitchen light, and headed upstairs. As I entered the bedroom, Emily looked up from her novel. "Who called so late?" she asked casually. I placed my telephone on the nightstand. "Someone asking me to make an important decision." She smiled without looking away from her book. "Well, at least somebody still thinks your opinion matters." Then she turned the page, never noticing that for the first time in our marriage, I did not answer. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of quiet that only exists before an important decision. The neighborhood was still asleep when I stepped outside with my coffee. A thin layer of dew covered the lawn, and the maple trees shimmered beneath the first light of dawn. 15 years earlier, Emily and I had planted that tree together after moving into our first home. She had laughed because neither of us knew anything about gardening. We learned together, just like we learned everything else back then. Funny how memories remain loyal long after people change. I stood there for several minutes listening to birds instead of business calls. Moments like that remind you what success is. Supposed to buy? Peace. Somewhere along the journey, too many people start chasing success so aggressively that they trade away the peace they were trying to earn. Emily came downstairs just after 7 wearing running clothes and checking emails before she even reached the kitchen. She poured herself coffee without looking up from her telephone. "Richard already sent 3 messages," she said with a tired smile. "Everyone is nervous about tomorrow." I nodded. "Big week." She sighed. "The biggest of my career." For a second, I almost told her everything. I almost told her that one electronic document sitting in my secure account could remove every ounce of anxiety she was carrying. I almost reminded her about every year we spent believing marriage meant solving problems together instead of competing over accomplishments. But I remained silent. Some truths lose their value when they are offered too early. Emily finally looked up. "You are awfully quiet today." I smiled gently. "Just thinking." "About what?" she asked. "Choices." She laughed lightly. "Life would be easier if people made decisions with logic instead of emotions." That sentence lingered in the room long after she grabbed her car keys and headed toward the garage. Once the front door closed, I returned to my office at the back of the house. The room looked ordinary to anyone else. Shelves filled with business books, family photographs, a walnut desk polished by years of daily use. Hidden inside that ordinary space were records spanning more than 2 decades of investments, partnerships, charitable foundations, and carefully built relationships. None of it existed to impress strangers. Wealth that constantly asks to be noticed usually disappears just as quickly. Real stability prefers privacy. I opened my secure laptop and logged into the encrypted document portal Daniel had mentioned the night before. The authorization package appeared immediately. Whitestone National Bank. Commercial expansion financing. $18 million. Final personal guarantee approval required. My name appeared near the bottom of the final page beside an empty signature line. I read every page again, even though I already knew the terms by heart. That habit had protected me countless times over the years. Never sign what you have not read. Never assume yesterday's agreement matches today's document. My father taught me that lesson when I was 23 years old, and I had never forgotten it. As I finished reviewing the paperwork, another notification appeared on my screen. Daniel had sent a short message. "The committee appreciates your careful review. No pressure. We simply need your answer before 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." I smiled at the phrase "no pressure." $18 million has a peculiar way of creating pressure, whether anyone admits it or not. I closed the document without signing and drove downtown instead. Sundays usually left the financial district nearly empty. The sidewalks felt peaceful without crowds rushing between office towers. I parked beside the river and walked several blocks until I reached a small diner that had served the same breakfast for decades. Margaret, the owner, recognized me immediately. "The usual?" she asked. "Please," I answered. She placed coffee in front of me before I even sat down. "You look like a man carrying something heavy." I smiled. "Nothing you can see." She nodded knowingly. "Those are usually the heaviest things." While eating breakfast, I watched families wander past the windows, tourists taking photographs, couples pushing strollers along the river walk. None of them knew that boardrooms across the city were preparing for decisions worth millions of dollars the next morning. Life has a way of reminding you that what feels enormous inside one building often means absolutely nothing outside it. My telephone vibrated once more. This time it was Emily. I answered immediately. "Hi." Her voice sounded rushed. "Richard just called an emergency executive meeting for this afternoon. The bank requested one last procedural review. They say everything should still be fine, but nobody likes surprises." I stared quietly through the diner window before answering. "Sometimes surprises turn out better than people expect." She laughed softly. "You always believe that, do you not?" There was a brief pause. "I believe people make their own luck." After the call ended, I remained seated for another few minutes. Her words echoed in my mind. People make their own luck. Perhaps. But they also build their lives on kindness they never notice, sacrifices they never witness, and signatures they never realize are protecting them until the day those signatures are no longer there. I finished my coffee, paid the bill, thanked Margaret, and walked back into the cool Chicago air knowing that by this time tomorrow, several people would discover that the strongest foundation beneath their success had never been the one they believed it was. By Sunday afternoon, the city seemed to be holding its breath. The financial district remained quieter than it would be the next morning, but inside conference rooms across Chicago, final presentations were being polished, spreadsheets reviewed one last time, and carefully rehearsed speeches practiced in front of reflective office windows. Emily left the house shortly after lunch wearing a navy business suit that had become her unofficial uniform for important meetings. She stopped at the front door only long enough to collect her laptop bag. "I probably will not be home until late," she said without looking up from another message on her telephone. "The executive team wants everyone available in case the bank asks additional questions." I nodded. "Drive safely." She hesitated for a second before adding, "Once this closes, everything changes." I smiled politely. "I hope it changes in the right direction." She gave me a puzzled look, as though my answer had not been enthusiastic enough, then disappeared through the front door. The house settled into silence once again. I walked back to my office, opened the secure document portal, and stared at the unsigned authorization waiting on my screen. My cursor rested over the signature line for several long seconds before I moved it away again. Important decisions deserve patience. Years ago, one of my earliest mentors told me that if a choice could still be made after one more hour of careful thinking, then one more hour was never wasted. I had followed that advice for decades. It had saved me from expensive mistakes more times than I could count. My telephone vibrated shortly after 3 o'clock. Daniel's name appeared again. "Good afternoon," I answered. "I wanted to give you an update," he said. "Richard Hayes just finished meeting with our commercial lending department. They are confident everything is ready. They have no idea the final authorization has not yet been completed." I looked toward the framed photograph sitting beside my monitor. It showed Emily and me standing in front of our first apartment building 15 years earlier, smiling with the confidence only young couples possess. We believed effort solved everything. We had not yet learned that success tests character far more than failure ever does. "How did Richard seem?" I asked. Daniel chuckled quietly. Relieved. He thanked everyone for their professionalism. He actually complimented the bank for making the process so smooth. I could not help smiling at that. Sometimes the smoothest process depends on work nobody sees. "Exactly," Daniel replied. He became serious again before continuing. "Michael, I know this is personal, but I want you to hear this from me instead of someone else. If you decide not to proceed, nobody on our side will question your integrity. Your obligation ended years ago, legally and financially, You owe this company nothing. I appreciated his honesty. Good advisors tell you what you need to hear, not what makes their job easier. Thank you, I said sincerely. That means more than you know. After the call ended, I remained seated for several minutes. Daniel was right. I did not owe the company anything. The question that refused to leave my mind was different. What kind of man did I want to become because of someone else's disappointment? It is surprisingly easy to justify revenge when life hands you the perfect opportunity. It is much harder to decide whether revenge actually improves the person looking for it. Around 5 o'clock, I drove downtown without telling anyone. The headquarters of Emily's company overlooked the Chicago River, its glass exterior reflecting the afternoon sunlight. Employees moved in and out carrying laptops and stacks of presentation folders. Through the lobby, windows, I could see groups gathered around conference tables preparing for Monday morning. Nobody noticed me standing across the street with a cup of coffee in my hand. They looked like people chasing a future they genuinely believed in. Receptionists answered calls. Analysts hurried between elevators. Maintenance staff polished floors before another busy week. None of them deserved to become casualties of executive pride. I finished my coffee and quietly walked away. On the drive home, memories continued surfacing one after another. Emily studying late into the night for professional certifications. The weekend trips we canceled because tuition payments came first. The countless evenings we celebrated tiny victories with inexpensive takeout because we believed bigger dreams required smaller sacrifices. Those memories were real. They deserved respect, even if the marriage standing in front of them no longer resembled the one behind them. Shortly after 7 that evening, another notification appeared on my telephone. This time it was an email from Whitestone National Bank, marked Final Authorization Required. I opened the secure link, reviewed every page once more, and slowly reached the final screen. The signature box waited exactly where it had been all day. My finger hovered above the authentication button. I thought about Emily's words at the gala. I thought about the laughter that followed. I thought about the hundreds of employees who would arrive at work Monday morning believing their future depended on leaders who cared about them. Then I thought about the man I wanted to see when I looked into the mirror 10 years from now. Quietly, without witnesses, without celebration, and without expecting anyone to ever thank me, I completed the authentication process. My electronic signature appeared beneath the guarantee in clean blue lettering. A confirmation message immediately filled the screen. Authorization successfully received. Commercial loan approved pending formal committee release. I closed the laptop, turned off the office light, and sat alone in the darkness for a long moment. Somewhere across the city, Emily was probably smiling because she believed tomorrow would become the greatest day of her career. She was right about one thing. Tomorrow would change everything. She simply did not yet understand why. Monday began before sunrise. I woke at 5:30 out of habit, not because an alarm demanded it. The house felt unusually still, as though even the walls understood that something important was about to happen. I brewed coffee, opened the kitchen blinds, and watched the first hints of daylight spread across the neighborhood. Emily came downstairs 20 minutes later dressed in a charcoal gray suit, her hair carefully pinned back, every detail prepared for what she believed would become the defining moment of her professional life. She barely touched her breakfast. Instead, she refreshed her electronic mail every few seconds while scanning the latest messages from Richard Hayes and the executive team. "Everyone is already at headquarters," she said. "The board wants us in the conference room before 8. I nodded while pouring another cup of coffee. "I hope everything goes smoothly." She looked at me with a confident smile that reminded me of the woman I had married years ago, before ambition slowly replaced gratitude. "Once this deal closes, people will finally see what I have built." I held her gaze for a moment before answering quietly. "I hope they see everything that helped build it." She frowned slightly, clearly unsure what I meant, but her telephone vibrated again before she could ask. She grabbed her laptop bag, kissed the air somewhere near my cheek without actually looking at me, and hurried toward the front door. "Do not wait up if tonight runs late," she called as she stepped outside. A few seconds later, her car disappeared down the street. I remained standing in the silent kitchen until the sound of the engine faded completely. At 7:45, my own telephone rang. "Daniel Brooks." "Good morning," I answered. "Good morning, Michael," he replied. His voice carried the calm confidence I had come to expect over the years. "Everything has been received." Your authorization cleared our verification system overnight without any issues. The committee meeting begins in 15 minutes. I thanked him before asking the question already forming in my mind. Does anyone at the company know yet? Not yet, Daniel answered. The executives believe today's presentation will simply confirm the approval. They still think the guarantee was finalized through standard internal procedures. I looked out the window toward the maple tree standing quietly in the front yard. Then let events unfold naturally. Daniel paused before speaking again. For what it is worth, Michael, the committee noticed something last night. What was that? I asked. You never requested recognition. You never negotiated new terms. You never asked for additional influence after signing. I smiled softly. Helping people should not always require an audience. Daniel laughed quietly. That philosophy is becoming rare. After ending the call, I drove into downtown Chicago without any particular destination in mind. Morning commuters filled the streets while office towers reflected the pale blue sky above Lake Michigan. Thousands of people hurried toward another workday, each carrying concerns invisible to everyone around them. I parked near Grant Park and walked slowly beneath rows of trees beginning to change color with the arrival of autumn. My telephone remained silent for almost an hour. Then, just after 9 o'clock, the first message arrived from Emily. It contained only 4 words. They approved everything. A second message followed almost immediately. Biggest day of my career. I smiled as I read them. She sounded genuinely happy, and despite everything that had happened between us, part of me was relieved. Success achieved without hurting innocent people is always worth celebrating. What saddened me was not her achievement. It was the story she believed about how that achievement had happened. Around 9:45, Daniel called again. This time there was unmistakable excitement beneath his normally measured tone. The formal announcement has been made, he said. The executive team is celebrating. I imagine they are, I replied. There is one more development, he continued. Richard requested a meeting with our senior lending officers to personally thank everyone involved. During that meeting, one of our directors mentioned that your guarantee was processed yesterday evening. I stopped walking. How did Richard respond? Daniel hesitated just long enough for me to picture the room in my mind. He thought there had been some misunderstanding. He said he did not recognize your name in relation to the financing package. And then, I asked quietly, our director explained that your financial guarantee has supported every major renewal connected to the company for years. The room became very quiet. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Quiet has a remarkable way of changing people. Laughter disappears inside it. Assumptions disappear inside it. Pride often does too. Daniel continued. Richard immediately asked legal counsel to bring him the historical records. I thanked him again before ending the call. Standing there beneath the cool Chicago sky, I realized the first crack had finally appeared in the version of reality Emily and her colleagues had believed for so long. The truth had not arrived with raised voices or dramatic speeches. It arrived the same way it usually does in business, calmly, professionally, and supported by documents that had been waiting patiently for someone to read them. Less than an hour after my conversation with Daniel, my telephone began vibrating again. This time it was not one call. It was 3 in a row from Emily. I watched the screen light up, then go dark, then light up again. 15 years earlier, I would have answered before the first ring finished. That morning I let the silence exist for a while. Not to punish her, but because some conversations deserve a few extra minutes to find the truth before words interrupt it. A text message arrived instead. Michael, where are you? Please call me when you can. The wording caught my attention immediately. There was no confidence in it. No hurried excitement. No assumption that I would simply answer because she expected me to. There was uncertainty. 10 minutes later, another message appeared. Richard wants to speak with you. It is important. I looked across the park where children chased pigeons while office workers hurried along the sidewalks, carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Life continued exactly as it had an hour earlier, even though somewhere inside a downtown boardroom, a carefully constructed illusion had begun falling apart. I finally returned Emily's call. She answered before the first ring ended. Michael, she said quickly. Where are you? Downtown, I answered calmly. What happened? There was a long pause before she spoke again. Richard just learned about the financing. I remained silent. He says your name has been connected to our banking relationship for years. Another pause followed. Is that true? I looked toward the river reflecting the morning sunlight. Yes. She sounded genuinely confused. Why would the bank need your approval? Because they trusted my guarantee. I heard her breathing change. Since when? Since before your company received its first major commercial credit facility. Nothing but silence answered me. Eventually she whispered, I do not understand. I know. She gathered herself before continuing. Richard wants to meet you. He says there must be some misunderstanding in the records. There is no misunderstanding, I replied gently. The documents will explain everything. She lowered her voice even further. Michael, why did you never tell me? That question stayed with me for several seconds before I answered. Because I wanted your success to belong to you. I never wanted you wondering whether people respected your work or my name. She did not respond. Sometimes the truth removes every sentence a person planned to say. Before ending the call, she quietly asked, Will you come to the office? Yes, I answered. I think it is time. I arrived at headquarters shortly after 11. The lobby looked exactly as it always had. Receptionists greeted visitors. Elevators opened and closed. Employees carried folders between departments without realizing anything unusual had happened. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm, there was a tension impossible to miss. The receptionist looked up from her desk and immediately recognized my name after I introduced myself. Her expression changed almost instantly. Mr. Carter, she said politely, they are expecting you. She stood before I could even thank her. The executive conference room is on the 32nd floor. That was different. During previous visits, I had waited in the lobby while Emily finished meetings. Today, someone was already holding the elevator open for me. As the doors closed, I caught my own reflection in the polished steel walls. The same navy jacket, the same simple watch, the same quiet man who had been laughed at only 2 nights earlier. Nothing about me had changed, only what other people knew. The elevator opened onto the executive floor with a soft chime. Through the glass walls, I could see assistants moving quickly between offices carrying folders marked confidential. One of them approached immediately. This way, Mr. Carter. She led me toward the largest conference room on the floor before opening the door. Richard Hayes stood at the far end of the polished table. Several senior executives sat beside him. Thick binders lay open in front of each chair. Emily was already there. She looked nothing like the confident executive who had left home that morning. She looked like someone trying to reconcile 2 completely different versions of the same person. Richard stepped forward before I had taken 2 steps into the room. His smile was polite, but noticeably restrained. Mr. Carter, he said carefully, extending his hand. Thank you for coming on such short notice. I accepted the handshake. Of course. He gestured toward the chair beside Emily. Please. We have been reviewing some historical banking documents, and I believe we owe you several questions. I glanced briefly at Emily before taking my seat. She could not meet my eyes. The room settled into complete silence. Richard slowly opened one of the binders in front of him, adjusted his reading glasses, and placed his finger on a page that had apparently changed everything. Mr. Carter, he said quietly, according to these records, our company would never have secured its original expansion financing without your personal guarantee. Legal counsel has now confirmed that every major renewal over the past 12 years has depended upon the continuation of that relationship. Before we discuss anything else, he stopped speaking for a moment and looked directly at me. Is every word of this documentation accurate? Richard's question hung in the conference room like the final note of a song nobody wanted to hear. Every executive at the table looked from the documents to my face, waiting for me to deny what had just been placed in front of them. I did not. Yes, I answered calmly. The records are accurate. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence felt heavier than any argument ever could. Richard slowly removed his reading glasses and placed them on the polished table. I have spent the last 40 minutes reviewing legal archives, lending agreements, and committee minutes dating back more than a decade, he said carefully. Every independent review reaches the same conclusion. He glanced toward the thick binder in front of him before looking back at me. Your financial guarantee established the confidence that allowed this company to secure its original expansion credit. Every subsequent renewal referenced the same relationship. Emily stared at me as though she were looking at a stranger. Why? She finally whispered. Why would you do that? I met her eyes for the first time since entering the room. Because I believed in you. She blinked several times, unable to answer. Richard leaned forward, folding his hands together. Mr. Carter, if you do not mind my asking, why was your involvement never disclosed to executive leadership? I smiled faintly. Because that was the agreement. He frowned. Whose agreement? Mine. The room became quiet again. When the bank first approached me, I agreed to support the company under one condition. Emily would never know. Neither would future executives unless disclosure became legally necessary. I wanted every promotion she earned to belong entirely to her own work. Emily lowered her head. I could see her hands trembling slightly against the conference table. I spent years believing I built everything myself, she said softly. In many ways, you did, I replied. You worked incredibly hard. You earned the respect of your colleagues. You solved problems that had nothing to do with me. My signature never replaced your effort. It only opened a door when everyone else refused to. Richard slowly leaned back in his chair. That explains something I never understood, he admitted. Several banks offered better rates over the years, yet our legal advisors always recommended staying with Whitestone National Bank. I assumed it was because of familiarity. I shook my head. It was because trust is more valuable than a slightly lower interest rate. One of the senior financial officers quietly turned another page inside the binder. These committee notes mention that your guarantee was renewed every time without requesting additional compensation. That is correct, I answered. You never received consulting fees? Another executive asked. No. Board influence? No. Equity? No. I smiled gently. Sometimes helping someone you love is enough. Nobody challenged that answer. Across the table, Emily covered her mouth with one hand as tears quietly gathered in her eyes. They were not dramatic tears. They looked more like the kind that appear when a person suddenly realizes how many small moments they misunderstood. The gala, she said almost to herself. I laughed. I remained silent. I called you. Her voice disappeared before she could finish the sentence. Richard looked uncharacteristically uncomfortable. Michael, he said, abandoning formal titles for the first time, I owe you an apology as well. At the gala, I allowed comments that never should have been made. Leadership begins with respect, and I failed to demonstrate it. I nodded once. I appreciate that. He took a slow breath before continuing. There is something else you should know. The board has already asked whether you would consider serving as an external strategic advisor after today's discovery. A few executives immediately nodded in agreement. I could not help smiling. Life has a remarkable sense of timing. 48 hours earlier, I had been the invisible husband standing quietly beside the ballroom windows. Now people who had barely noticed my presence were discussing advisory positions as though titles could somehow rewrite the past. Thank you, I said politely, but I am not interested. Richard looked surprised. May I ask why? I glanced around the room before answering. Because I never wanted influence over this company. I only wanted the people inside it to have the opportunity to succeed. The executives exchanged quiet looks with one another. Emily finally lifted her eyes again. They were filled with regret instead of confidence now. Michael, she whispered, can we talk? Just the two of us, after this meeting? I studied her face for a long moment. The arrogance that had grown over so many years had vanished. In its place stood the woman I once believed would always stand beside me. The difference was that understanding had arrived far too late. I gave her a small, respectful nod. Yes, I said calmly. We should. The conference room slowly emptied after Richard thanked everyone for their professionalism and announced that the remaining agenda items would be postponed until the following day. One by one, the executives quietly collected their binders and left without the confident conversations that had filled the room earlier that morning. The atmosphere had changed completely. Success still belonged to the company, but pride no longer belonged to the people who thought they had created it alone. Within a few minutes, only Emily and I remained. The door closed softly behind the last assistant, leaving us surrounded by silence and the Chicago skyline stretching beyond the glass walls. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Emily stood beside the conference table with both hands resting lightly against the polished wood, staring down at the stack of documents that had rewritten the story she believed about our lives. Finally, she looked up. I do not know where to begin. I nodded gently. The beginning is usually the best place. She took a slow breath. When we were younger, I used to tell everyone that you were the strongest person I knew. You never needed attention. You never needed people to tell you that you mattered. A faint smile crossed my face. I remember. Her eyes filled again, but she remained composed. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing that. I started measuring people, the way everyone around me measured them. Promotions, titles, public recognition, expensive offices. I convinced myself those things defined success. I listened without interrupting. She deserved the chance to hear her own thoughts out loud. When I laughed at the gala, she continued quietly, I thought I was protecting my image. I never realized I was destroying something far more valuable. I walked toward the windows overlooking the river below. Boats moved slowly through the water while pedestrians crossed the bridges without knowing that two lives were quietly changing several stories above them. Respect disappears long before love does, I said. Most people never notice the difference until one of them is gone. Emily lowered her head. Can you forgive me? I remained silent for several seconds before answering honestly. I already have. She looked surprised. Then, can we start over? That question deserved honesty as well. I turned to face her. Forgiveness and rebuilding are not the same thing. She closed her eyes briefly as the meaning settled in. I understand. For years, I continued calmly. I believed that supporting you quietly was the greatest gift I could give our marriage. I never wanted recognition. I never wanted gratitude. I only hoped we would always remain on the same team. I smiled sadly. Somewhere along the way, I became someone you needed to explain instead of someone you were proud to stand beside. Tears rolled slowly down her cheeks, but she made no attempt to hide them. I cannot change what I said. No, I agreed. But you can decide who you become after today. She nodded silently. We stood there for another quiet moment before I reached into my briefcase and removed a thin folder. I placed it gently on the table between us. What is this? She asked. The documents releasing my personal guarantee from future financing renewals after the current agreement expires. Her eyes widened. You are ending it. The company is financially strong now. It no longer needs my name standing quietly behind it. She looked at the folder without touching it. And us. I answered with the same calm voice I had carried throughout the day. I think we both need time to discover who we are without pretending everything is still the same. She slowly nodded. There was sadness in her expression, but also acceptance. For the first time in years, neither of us was hiding behind pride. Before leaving, Richard briefly stepped back into the conference room. He looked from Emily to me before speaking. Michael, I simply wanted to thank you again. Not only for what you have done for this company, but for the way you handled today. Most people would have chosen humiliation after what happened at the gala. I smiled politely. Humiliation rarely teaches the lesson people think it does. Truth usually works better. Richard extended his hand once more. This time the gesture carried genuine respect rather than professional courtesy. I accepted it, wished both of them well, and quietly left the building. Outside, the cool afternoon breeze rolled through the streets of Chicago as people hurried toward trains, restaurants, and ordinary Monday afternoons. The city looked exactly as it had the day before, yet everything felt different. I walked slowly across the bridge overlooking the river and thought about something my father once told me when I was a young man struggling to build my first business. He said, never confuse being underestimated with being unimportant. The strongest foundations are usually the ones nobody notices until they are removed. I finally understood the full meaning of those words. Real success was never about proving someone wrong. It was about becoming the kind of person who could do the right thing even after being misunderstood. Titles fade. Money changes hands. Companies rise and fall. Character is the only investment that continues paying long after everyone stops keeping score. As I disappeared into the afternoon crowd, I carried no anger, no desire for revenge, and no need for applause. I had protected what mattered when it needed protecting, spoken the truth when it was finally time, and walked away with the one thing no promotion, no bank, and no boardroom could ever give me back or take away from me again: my quiet self-respect.